No heir passed the blood trial, until a human janitor's cut awakened the throne. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The Imperial Palace of Valtaris stood as a monument to 10,000 years of unbroken rule, its crystalline spires reaching toward 3 purple moons that hung in the alien sky. Within its gleaming halls, where nobles draped in silk and precious metals whispered of succession and power, a human janitor named Ethan Cole pushed his cleaning cart past murals depicting the glory of emperors long dead, invisible to those who mattered. The Valtarian Empire stretched across 47 star systems, a dominion so vast that entire human colonies existed as mere footnotes in their administrative records. The Valtarians themselves were a proud species, tall and elegant with skin that shimmered like polished jade and eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Their lifespans extended for nearly 500 years, and their culture valued tradition above all else. At the heart of their society stood the blood trial, an ancient ritual that had determined the rightful heir to the throne since the empire's founding. Ethan had been working in the palace for 3 years, one of perhaps 24 humans employed in various menial positions throughout the sprawling complex. He was 32 years old, of average height and build, with brown hair that perpetually needed cutting and hazel eyes that had learned to avoid direct contact with his Valtarian employers. His story was unremarkable by human standards. He had arrived on Valtaris Prime seeking opportunity, found none, and had settled for the only work available to someone with no connections and no particular skills. The pay was adequate, the hours were long, and the work was honest if thankless. The blood trial had become the talk of the palace over the past 6 months. Emperor Thaldrin the Wise had passed into the eternal sleep at the venerable age of 483, leaving behind a complicated succession. He had sired 7 children by 3 different consorts, and according to ancient law, each had the right to attempt the trial. The ritual itself was shrouded in mystery, conducted in the Chamber of Origins deep beneath the palace where no common eyes were permitted. All anyone knew was that each heir would place their hand upon the throne of ancients and allow their blood to mingle with the sacred stone. The throne would recognize the true heir, or so the legends claimed, by awakening and bestowing its blessing. 6 heirs had already attempted the trial. 6 had failed. Prince Mordeth, the eldest, had emerged from the chamber pale and shaking, his hand wrapped in silver cloth to hide whatever injury he had sustained. Princess Celera had lasted mere moments before her screams echoed through the palace corridors. One by one, the children of Thaldrin had entered the Chamber of Origins with confidence and emerged defeated, some bearing physical wounds, others marked only by the haunted look in their ancient eyes. The court whispered that the throne had rejected them all, that perhaps the bloodline had grown too diluted over the millennia, that the gods were displeased with the empire's direction. The 7th and final heir, Prince Cauldron, was scheduled to attempt the trial on the night of the triple moon convergence, a celestial event that occurred only once every 11 years. The entire palace buzzed with nervous energy. If Cauldron failed like his siblings, there would be no clear successor, and the empire would fall into chaos. Civil war was a very real possibility. The great houses were already positioning themselves, forming alliances and making veiled threats. Ethan knew all of this only through overheard conversations and the gossip of other servants. He had no stake in Valtarian politics, no opinion on who should rule. His concerns were simpler: finishing his shift without incident, sending money back to his sister on Earth who was raising 2 kids alone, and maybe getting a decent meal before bed. The palace kitchens sometimes had leftovers that the cooks would share with the human staff, though never the delicacies prepared for the nobles. On the day before the final trial, Ethan was assigned to clean the Hall of Remembrance, a vast corridor lined with statues of past emperors and empresses. It was delicate work, requiring him to carefully dust priceless artifacts and polish floors of imported marble that cost more per square foot than he made in a year. He worked methodically, his mind wandering as his hands moved through familiar motions. He was polishing the base of Emperor Valdan, the Conqueror's statue, when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the soft, measured tread of Valtarian nobles, but something quicker, almost frantic. Ethan looked up to see a young Valterian male rushing down the corridor, his robes disheveled and his jade skin glistening with sweat. The young man's eyes were wide with panic. Ethan recognized him, though they had never spoken. Prince Cauldron, the last hope of the imperial bloodline. The prince was considered the least likely to succeed among the heirs, too young at only 73 years old and too scholarly in his pursuits. While his siblings had trained in statecraft and military strategy, Cauldron had spent his time in the ancient libraries, studying texts that most Valterians considered obsolete. The prince didn't seem to notice Ethan at first, too consumed by whatever crisis drove him. He was carrying something, clutching it to his chest like a precious treasure. As he drew closer, Ethan could see it was a book, ancient and crumbling, its pages yellowed with age. Then Cauldron tripped. It happened so fast that Ethan barely had time to register the movement. The prince's foot caught on the hem of his own robe, and he stumbled forward, the book flying from his hands. It sailed through the air in a slow arc, and Ethan, acting on pure instinct, lunged forward to catch it. He missed. His fingers brushed the leather cover, but the book slipped through his grasp and hit the marble floor with a sickening crack. Pages scattered like dying leaves, centuries-old parchment tearing and crumbling upon impact. The sound echoed through the hall like a death knell. Cauldron fell to his knees beside the destroyed book, his hands hovering over the scattered pages as if afraid to touch them. His breath came in short gasps, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I am ruined," he said in Valterian, the language's musical tones tinged with despair. This was the only copy, the only proof. Now there is no hope. Ethan didn't speak much Valterian, but he understood enough to grasp the prince's distress. He knelt down beside Cauldron and began carefully gathering the scattered pages, handling them with the same care he used when cleaning priceless artifacts. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," Ethan said in his accented Valterian. "I tried to catch it." Cauldron looked at him then, really looked at him, and Ethan saw something unexpected in the prince's eyes. Not anger, not the disdain he had come to expect from Valterian nobility, but a bone-deep sadness mixed with what might have been resignation. "You are human," Cauldron said, switching to trade standard, the common language of interstellar commerce. Ethan appreciated the courtesy. "You cannot be blamed for failing to catch something that I, in my foolishness, dropped." The prince carefully gathered the remaining pages, his long fingers trembling slightly. Some pages had shattered into fragments too small to read, centuries of knowledge reduced to dust in an instant. "May I ask what the book was?" Ethan ventured, knowing he was probably overstepping but unable to contain his curiosity. Cauldron was silent for a long moment, staring at the broken remnants in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. "Research," he said. "Ancient research into the nature of the blood trial. I have spent the last 40 years studying the ritual, trying to understand why it has become so difficult for heirs to pass." "Do you know the history, human?" Ethan shook his head. "I know only what everyone knows. The throne chooses the rightful heir." A bitter smile crossed Cauldron's face. "The throne does not choose. It tests. In ancient times, when our people first unified under the first emperor, the throne was created by the architects, a race so old that even their name is uncertain. They built it as a safeguard, a way to ensure that only those fit to rule could claim the crown. The trial requires the heir to place their hand upon the throne's surface and allow their blood to touch the ancient mechanisms within." He paused, looking down at his own hand. "The throne reads the blood, analyzes it at a level deeper than mere genetics. It searches for something specific, though what exactly has been lost to time. In the early centuries, the trial was simple. Nearly every heir passed on their first attempt. But over the millennia, something has changed. The last 300 years have seen increasing failure rates. My grandfather took 17 attempts before succeeding. My father took 43. And now my siblings have all failed completely. Why?" Ethan asked. "What changed?" "That is what I was trying to discover," Cauldron said, gesturing to the destroyed book. This text was written by Emperor Thoras the Scholar 2,000 years ago. He theorized that the throne was not searching for genetic purity or strength of will, but for something he called the spark of innovation. He believed that the architects designed the trial to recognize those who could adapt and change, who could lead the Empire into new eras rather than simply maintaining the old ways. Ethan considered this. And you think your people have lost that spark? Cauldron nodded slowly. We have become too rigid, too bound by tradition. We maintain rather than create, preserve rather than discover. The very qualities that made us an empire are the ones the throne now rejects. He stood, clutching the ruined pages to his chest. And now the only text that might have guided me to success is destroyed. Tomorrow I will attempt the trial and fail like my siblings before me. The empire will fall into chaos, and countless worlds will suffer for it. The prince began to walk away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Ethan watched him go, feeling a strange empathy for this alien noble who seemed so utterly lost. On impulse, he called out, "Your Highness," Ethan said. "What if you're looking at it wrong?" Cauldron stopped and turned, surprise evident on his jade features. "I beg your pardon?" Ethan stood, wiping his hands on his cleaning smock. "I mean, you said the throne is looking for innovation, for the ability to adapt. Maybe your people have been trying too hard to understand it, to prepare for it. Maybe the throne doesn't want someone who has studied for 40 years how to pass the test. Maybe it wants someone who can face the unknown and adapt in the moment." The prince stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are a janitor," he said finally, and Ethan couldn't tell if it was a statement or a question. "Yes, Your Highness. I clean floors and dust statues. I'm not educated or particularly clever, but I've learned that sometimes when you overthink something, you make it harder than it needs to be." Cauldron's eyes narrowed slightly. "Have you ever faced a challenge that seemed impossible?" Ethan thought about his life, about leaving Earth with dreams of adventure and finding only hard work and obscurity, about his sister's husband abandoning her with 2 young children, about scraping together money for their school fees while barely feeding himself, about 1,000 small humiliations and disappointments that came with being human in an empire that saw his species as useful but unremarkable. "Every day, Your Highness," he said quietly. "Every single day I face challenges that seem impossible. But you adapt. You find a way. You do what needs to be done, even when you don't know how you're going to do it." The prince regarded him with an intensity that made Ethan uncomfortable. Then Cauldron did something that shocked him. The prince bowed, a slight inclination of his head that was still more respect than any Valterian noble had ever shown a human servant. "Thank you for your counsel, Janitor, and for trying to save this book. I will remember your words when I enter the chamber tomorrow." Then he was gone, leaving Ethan alone in the Hall of Remembrance with his cleaning cart and his thoughts. The next day arrived with an electric tension that permeated every corner of the palace. Ethan's supervisor, a gruff Valterian named Torval who had the disposition of a disappointed parent, assigned him to clean the lower levels, far from where the trial would take place. The ceremony was for nobility only, witnessed by the heads of the great houses and the high priests of the old religion. Servants were explicitly forbidden from the area. Ethan spent the morning scrubbing floors in the servants' quarters, his mind wandering to the prince and their strange conversation. He wondered if his words had been presumptuous, if Cauldron had been offended by a human daring to offer advice on Valterian affairs. He also wondered, with a curiosity he knew was pointless, what would happen if Cauldron failed? Would there be war? Would the empire fragment? And what would happen to the humans like him who depended on the stability of Valterian rule for their livelihoods? Around midday, alarm bells began to ring throughout the palace. Not the musical chimes that announced ceremonies or celebrations, but harsh, discordant clanging that signaled emergency. Ethan straightened from his work, his heart beginning to pound. Around him, other servants emerged from their tasks, looking around with confusion and fear. Torval appeared in the corridor, his jade skin pale with stress. "Everyone to your quarters," he barked. "No one is to leave until given clearance. There has been an incident." "What kind of incident?" someone asked, but Torval was already moving on, repeating his orders to the next group of servants. The human workers gathered in their shared dormitory, a sparse but clean set of rooms in the palace's eastern wing. There were 23 humans employed at the palace, ranging from young workers fresh from Earth to veterans who had been in Valterian service for decades. They speculated wildly about what might have happened. Had Cauldron failed? Had there been an attack? Was the Empire at war? Hours passed with no information. The bells eventually stopped, but no one came to give them clearance to leave. Ethan lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of helplessness that came from being insignificant in a universe of vast powers and ancient grudges. It was nearly midnight when Torval finally appeared at their door. His expression was grim, and his eyes held something Ethan had never seen before in the usually stern supervisor. It looked almost like fear. "Ethan Cole," Torval said, his voice carrying across the dormitory. "You are summoned to the Chamber of Origins immediately." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Ethan, and he felt his stomach drop. "Me?" Ethan managed to say. "There must be some mistake. I'm not allowed in that part of the palace." "There is no mistake," Torval said. "Prince Cauldron has requested you specifically. Come now. Do not keep them waiting." Ethan rose on unsteady legs, aware of the stares of his fellow humans. He followed Torval out of the dormitory and through corridors he had only cleaned from a distance, never daring to walk as anything other than invisible help. They descended deeper into the palace, past checkpoints where guards in ceremonial armor watched him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Finally, they reached a massive door carved from a single piece of black stone. Ancient symbols covered its surface, and even Ethan, who knew nothing of Valterian religion, could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Two high priests in elaborate robes stood before the door, their expressions carefully neutral. "The human," one of them said to Torval. "He may enter alone." Torval nodded and gestured for Ethan to approach. The janitor forced his legs to move, each step feeling like it might be his last. The priests studied him with eyes that had witnessed centuries of history, and Ethan felt like an insect under their scrutiny. "You have been summoned by Prince Cauldron," one priest said in trade standard. "The trial has encountered an unprecedented complication. Do you swear by whatever powers your kind holds sacred that you will speak truthfully of what you witness within?" "I swear," Ethan said, his mouth dry. The priests exchanged glances, then one placed his hand on the door. It swung open silently, revealing a chamber beyond that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ethan stepped through, and the door closed behind him with a finality that made his heart race. The Chamber of Origins was smaller than he expected, roughly circular with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow. The walls were covered in more of the ancient symbols, and they seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence. In the center of the chamber sat the throne of ancients. It was not what Ethan had imagined. He had expected gold and jewels, ornate carvings, and displays of wealth. Instead, the throne was simple, almost austere, carved from the same black stone as the door. It seemed to drink in the light around it, creating an aura of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. The stone had a strange quality, as if it was not entirely solid, shifting subtly at the edges of perception. Prince Cauldron stood beside the throne, his right hand wrapped in crimson bandages. Blood had soaked through the cloth and dripped onto the floor, but the prince seemed oblivious to his injury. His eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Around the chamber stood the witnesses of the trial. Ethan recognized several faces from his time cleaning the upper palace. There was Lady Morvanna, head of House Silvaris, her elaborate gown glittering with thousands of tiny gems. Lord Thindril of House Ironpeak stood with his massive arms crossed, his jade skin darker than most Valterians and marked with ritual scars. The High Council members were present, along with more priests and several figures in military uniforms that denoted ranks Ethan didn't understand. All of them were staring at him. "Ethan Cole," Cauldron said, his voice stronger than it had been the day before, but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled emotion. "I apologize for summoning you in such a manner, but circumstances have become extraordinary." "Your Highness," Ethan said, bowing as he had seen other servants do. "I don't understand. Why am I here?" Cauldron gestured to the throne. "I attempted the trial, as you know. When I placed my hand upon the throne and allowed my blood to touch its surface, I expected rejection like my siblings. Instead, something happened. Something that has not occurred in recorded history." The prince moved closer to the throne, and Ethan could see that the surface where Cauldron's blood had touched was glowing, pulsing with a rhythmic light like a heartbeat. "The throne did not reject me," Cauldron continued, "but neither did it accept me. Instead, it showed me something. A vision, or perhaps a message from the architects themselves. It showed me that the bloodline of emperors has indeed grown stagnant, that my people have lost the quality the throne seeks. But it also showed me something else. It showed me that the answer to this dilemma is here, in this palace, and that the answer is not Valterian. The assembled nobles erupted in shocked murmurs. Lady Morvanna stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You speak madness, Prince Cauldron. The throne has been Valterian for 10,000 years. It cannot choose an outsider. Can it not?" Cauldron challenged. "We do not even fully understand how it works, yet we presume to know its limitations." The vision was clear. There is one within these walls who possesses what the throne seeks, and that individual is not of our blood. "Then let them step forward," Lord Thindril rumbled. "Let us see who the throne has chosen." "That is why I summoned you," Cauldron said, turning his full attention to Ethan. "Yesterday, when we spoke, you demonstrated something I have not seen in decades of studying my own people. You approached the problem of the trial from a completely different perspective, one unbound by our traditions and assumptions. You spoke of adaptation and innovation, the very qualities the throne seeks. And so I asked the throne, in my desperation, if you might be the answer." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Your Highness, I'm just a janitor. I'm nobody. I don't even understand Valterian politics, let alone how to rule an empire." "Understanding politics is not what the throne seeks," Cauldron said. "The throne seeks something deeper. A quality of spirit, a capacity for growth and change." He unwrapped his bandaged hand, revealing a deep cut across his palm that should have stopped bleeding by now, but continued to weep crimson. "When I asked the throne about you, it reacted. The vision changed. It showed me that you must attempt the trial." The chamber erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted over each other, priests invoked ancient laws, and military officers reached for weapons they were not carrying. Through it all, Ethan stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. "This is blasphemy," Lady Morvanna shrieked. "A human? On the throne of ancients? We would be the laughingstock of the galaxy. We are already facing annihilation," Cauldron shot back. "6 of my siblings have failed. I have failed. If we do not find a solution, there will be civil war. Is your pride worth the death of billions?" That silenced the chamber, though the hostility in the air was palpable. The highest-ranking priest, an ancient Valterian whose skin had faded to almost white with age, stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried absolute authority. "Prince Cauldron," the priest said, "you ask us to consider the impossible. Never in our history has a non-Valterian been permitted to touch the throne of ancients, let alone attempt the trial. The religious implications alone are staggering." "I understand, Your Holiness," Cauldron said, bowing deeply. "But I also understand that our empire stands on the brink of destruction. If the throne itself has indicated a solution, do we not have a sacred duty to explore it?" The old priest studied Ethan with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. "You are human," he said, "a species young by our standards, barely 1,000 years out of your solar system. Your people have no concept of the spiritual weight of what is being proposed." Ethan found his voice, though it shook. "Your Holiness, you're right. I don't understand the spiritual implications. I don't understand Valterian religion or culture or any of this. But I do understand desperation. If there's any chance I can help prevent a war, even if I don't understand how, shouldn't we try?" "Brave words," Lord Thindril said. "Or foolish ones. Human, do you understand what the trial entails? You will place your hand upon the throne and cut your palm, allowing your blood to touch the ancient mechanisms. The throne will judge you at a level you cannot comprehend. If it finds you wanting, the rejection could kill you. Several of Prince Cauldron's siblings have been permanently injured by their failures." Ethan swallowed hard. "I understand the risk, your lordship." "Do you?" the war leader challenged. "Your people live such brief lives, barely a century if you are fortunate. You have not the patience or wisdom that comes with centuries of life. What makes you think you could possibly possess what the throne seeks?" "Maybe that's exactly why I might," Ethan said, the words coming before he could stop them. "You said it yourself. We live brief lives. Every day counts for us in a way it might not for someone who knows they have centuries ahead. We have to adapt quickly or die. We don't have the luxury of spending 40 years studying a problem. We face the unknown and figure it out as we go, because that's all we can do. The chamber fell silent again. Cauldron was nodding slowly, a strange light in his eyes. Yes, he said softly. Yes, exactly that. That is what the throne showed me. Humanity's greatest weakness is also its greatest strength. You burn bright and brief, forced to innovate and adapt at a pace we have forgotten how to match. Lady Morvanna looked around at the assembled nobles and priests. This is insanity, she said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. But I suppose we are already in the realm of the unprecedented. If the prince believes this strongly, and if the throne has given indication, perhaps we must consider it. She fixed Ethan with a hard stare. But understand, human, if you fail, the consequences will fall on your people as well as yourself. There are many who would see your failure as proof that humanity should know its place. Ethan met her gaze as steadily as he could. I understand, my lady. The high priest raised a withered hand. If this is to proceed, it must be done properly. The trial is sacred, and even in these extraordinary circumstances, the rituals must be observed. He turned to Cauldron. Prince, you must formally withdraw your claim and nominate this human as your proxy in the trial. It is an ancient precedent, rarely used, but legally sound. Cauldron nodded and turned to face Ethan. He dropped to one knee, and the gesture sent a shock through the assembled nobles. A prince of the blood did not kneel to anyone except the emperor. Ethan Cole of Earth, Cauldron said, his voice formal and carrying the weight of ritual. I, Cauldron, seventh heir of Emperor Thaldron the Wise, hereby withdraw my claim to the throne of ancients. In accordance with the law of proxy established in the Second Age, I nominate you as my representative in the blood trial. Should you succeed, you will rule not in your own name, but as my proxy, bound by my guidance and the counsel of the High Council. Do you accept this charge? Ethan's mind reeled. A proxy, not actually becoming emperor, but acting as one. It was a crucial distinction, one that made the situation marginally less insane. He looked around at the faces watching him, seeing everything from hope to disgust to naked hostility. He thought about his sister on Earth, about the millions of humans living under Valtarian rule, about the billions of Valtarians and other species whose lives would be thrown into chaos if civil war erupted. I accept, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Cauldron rose and placed his uninjured hand on Ethan's shoulder. Then by the ancient laws and in the presence of these witnesses, I name you my proxy. May the ancestors guide your hand. The high priest approached, carrying a ceremonial knife that gleamed with an edge so sharp it seemed to cut the air itself. Ethan Cole, proxy of Prince Cauldron, you will now attempt the blood trial. Place your right hand upon the surface of the throne. When I give the word, use this blade to cut your palm. Allow your blood to flow freely onto the throne. Do not remove your hand until the throne releases you, no matter what you experience. Ethan took the knife with a hand that only trembled slightly. He approached the throne of ancients, and as he drew closer, he felt something he had not expected. The throne seemed to hum, a vibration at the very edge of perception. It was not sound exactly, but a resonance that he felt in his bones. The black stone surface was cool under his left hand as he placed it flat against the armrest. He could see Cauldron's blood still glistening on the seat itself, the earlier glow fading but not gone. Ethan positioned the knife against his right palm, the metal cold against his skin. When you are ready, the high priest said, may the architects judge with wisdom. Ethan took a deep breath and drew the blade across his palm in one quick motion. The pain was sharp and immediate, blood welling up from the cut. He pressed his bleeding hand onto the throne's surface, feeling his blood mix with Cauldron's. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world disappeared. Ethan found himself floating in a void of absolute blackness, his body weightless and insubstantial. He tried to scream, but had no mouth. He tried to see, but had no eyes. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but then he remembered his own words to Cauldron. Adapt in the moment. Face the unknown. He forced himself to calm, to accept the sensation of floating in nothingness. As his panic receded, he became aware of presences in the void with him. They had no form he could identify, but he sensed them nonetheless, vast and ancient and utterly alien. They pressed in on his consciousness from all sides, and he understood with sudden clarity that these were the architects, or at least some echo of them, preserved within the throne across countless millennia. They were examining him, probing his thoughts and memories with a thoroughness that should have been violating but somehow felt curious rather than hostile. They rifled through his life like someone flipping through a book, seeing his childhood on Earth, his decision to leave home seeking adventure, his years of disappointment and hard work. They saw his relationship with his sister, his love for her children, his quiet determination to send money home even when it meant going hungry himself. They saw every moment of frustration, every time he had been dismissed or ignored because he was human. They saw him cleaning the palace, making himself invisible, accepting his place in a hierarchy that valued him only for his labor. But they also saw the moments of adaptation, the times when he had found solutions to problems without instructions, when he had improvised and succeeded through trial and error rather than planning. Then the architects showed him their purpose. Through images and sensations that bypassed language entirely, they communicated the reason for the throne's existence. They had created it not to crown the strongest or the smartest, but to identify those capable of guiding their people through change. The early Valtarian emperors had possessed this quality in abundance, but over millennia of stability, it had been bred out of the imperial bloodline. The species had become too focused on maintaining what was rather than discovering what could be. The architects showed Ethan the fate of previous empires they had guided, species that had grown too rigid and ultimately collapsed under the weight of their own inability to adapt. They showed him the delicate balance between tradition and innovation, between respecting the past and embracing the future. They showed him that humanity, for all its flaws and relative youth, possessed the spark of adaptability in abundance. Humans had spread across the galaxy in mere centuries, adapting to alien worlds and cultures with a flexibility that older species had lost. And then the architects asked him a question, not in words but in pure meaning. Could he guide the Valtarians back toward balance? Could he help them remember how to change without losing who they were? Could he rule not as a conqueror or a puppet, but as a bridge between human adaptability and Valtarian wisdom? Ethan's response came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. He could try. He could fail, but he could try. And perhaps that willingness to attempt the impossible despite uncertainty was exactly what the throne sought. The void shattered like glass, and Ethan found himself back in the Chamber of Origins, his hands still pressed against the throne. But everything had changed. The black stone was now glowing with brilliant white light, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The ancient symbols on the walls blazed with matching luminescence, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living things. And the throne itself was changing, the stone becoming almost translucent, revealing intricate mechanisms within that looked like nothing Ethan had ever seen, part organic and part crystalline, alien in ways his mind struggled to comprehend. The assembled nobles and priests had fallen to their knees, their faces reflecting awe and terror in equal measure. Cauldron alone remained standing, tears streaming down his jade face, his expression one of vindication and wonder. The throne spoke. It did not use words or sound, but every person in the chamber heard it nonetheless, a voice that resonated directly in their minds with the weight of eons. It spoke in Valtarian and trade standard simultaneously, making itself understood by all present. The trial is complete, the throne said. The proxy of Cauldron has been judged and found worthy. The spark of innovation burns within this human, untarnished by millennia of comfort. He shall serve as Emperor-Regent, guiding the empire through its transformation while teaching by example what has been forgotten. The bloodline of emperors is not ended but renewed, joined now with the bloodline of humanity. The empire will adapt or fall. Choose wisely. The light faded, and the throne returned to its original black stone appearance. Ethan pulled his hand away, looking down in shock. The cut on his palm had healed, leaving only a thin white scar in the shape of one of the ancient symbols. His hand tingled with residual energy, and he felt different somehow, as if the throne had left an imprint on him that went beyond the physical mark. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Then, slowly, Cauldron approached and once again dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty," he said, "Emperor Regent." The throne has chosen. I pledge my loyalty and my guidance for as long as you require it. One by one, the others in the chamber followed suit. Some did so eagerly, others reluctantly, but all recognized the authority of the throne's judgment. Even Lady Morvana, her expression complex and unreadable, knelt and bowed her head. Ethan stood before them, a human janitor who had woken that morning expecting to clean floors, now designated as the ruler of a 47-system empire. The absurdity of it threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed the feeling aside. He had faced the architects and survived. He had been judged worthy. Now he had to figure out what that meant. "Your Majesty," the high priest said, rising from his knees with effort. "There are ceremonies to be conducted, oaths to be sworn, coronations to be planned. The galaxy must be informed that the Empire has a new ruler." Ethan found his voice, and when he spoke, he was surprised by the steadiness in it. "Before any of that, I need to understand what I've agreed to. Prince Cauldron, you will be my primary advisor, as the throne designated. But I will also need counsel from all of you." He gestured to the assembled nobles and officials. "I don't pretend to understand Valterian culture or the complexities of running an empire. I'm going to make mistakes, probably many of them. But I'm also going to bring a different perspective, and together, we're going to figure out how to move forward." Lord Thindril rose, his massive frame somehow less intimidating now. "Your Majesty speaks with unexpected wisdom. The throne has chosen well, it seems. You will have my support and the might of House Ironpeak behind you." Other voices chimed in with their pledges, though Ethan could hear the reservations behind some of them. He had no illusions that this would be easy. There would be opposition, both from those who saw his selection as an abomination and from those who would seek to manipulate an inexperienced ruler for their own gain. But as he stood in the Chamber of Origins, surrounded by kneeling nobles and glowing ancient symbols, Ethan felt something he had not experienced in years. Purpose. For the first time since leaving Earth, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, doing something that mattered. The path ahead would be difficult and dangerous. He would need to learn an entire empire's worth of politics and culture while somehow maintaining the very qualities that had made the throne choose him. He would need to balance human instinct with Valterian wisdom, innovation with tradition, his own judgment with the council of beings who had centuries more experience than he could ever hope to possess. But he had adapted before. He had faced impossible situations with nothing but determination and hope. And now, with the blessing of a 10,000-year-old throne and the guidance of a prince who had spent 40 years studying how to rule, he had a chance to do something extraordinary. The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes the most unlikely person in the room was exactly the right choice. And the Valterian Empire, whether it was ready or not, was about to learn what happened when you gave a human janitor the keys to an entire civilization. The following days passed in a blur of ceremonies, meetings, and information that threatened to overwhelm Ethan's ability to process. He was moved from his small dormitory room to the Imperial Suite, a series of chambers so vast that he got lost twice trying to find the bathroom. An entire staff was assigned to him, Valterian servants who bowed and scraped with every interaction, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes betraying everything from wonder to resentment. Cauldron became his constant companion, teaching him the basics of imperial protocol and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized Valterian nobility. The prince proved to be a patient teacher, never condescending despite Ethan's ignorance of even basic concepts. They would spend hours each day in the Imperial Library, a cathedral of knowledge that held millions of texts dating back to the Empire's founding. The most important thing to understand, Cauldron explained one morning as they reviewed star charts showing the Empire's extent, is that the Valterian Empire is not actually a monolithic entity. It is more accurate to think of it as a federation of powerful houses, each controlling several systems, all loosely bound by loyalty to the throne and the benefits of mutual cooperation. Ethan studied the chart, noting how different colors indicated different house territories. So they could split off if they wanted? Theoretically, yes. In practice, the military and economic integration is so complete that secession would be devastating for any house that attempted it. But that does not mean they are powerless. Each house has its own fleets, its own resources, its own agenda. Your role as Emperor Regent is not to command them as subjects, but to guide them as leader of equals. It sounded like herding cats on an interstellar scale. And they're all just going to accept being guided by a human? Cauldron's expression grew serious. No, Your Majesty. Many will resist, some openly and others through subtle obstruction. You must understand that the throne's choice was unprecedented. There are factions that believe you should not have been allowed to attempt the trial, let alone succeed. Your legitimacy will be questioned constantly, at least in the beginning. How do I deal with that? By succeeding, Cauldron said simply. The throne chose you because you possess qualities the Empire needs. Demonstrate those qualities. Show them that human adaptability is not a weakness, but a strength. Make decisions that prove the wisdom of the throne's choice. No pressure then, Ethan muttered, earning a puzzled look from Cauldron before the prince realized it was humor. The formal coronation was scheduled for 2 weeks after the trial, allowing time for representatives from all major houses to arrive at the capital. In the meantime, Ethan was introduced to the High Council, the body of advisors that handled the day-to-day administration of the empire. There were 12 council members, each responsible for a different aspect of governance: military affairs, economic policy, foreign relations, internal security, and so on. They met in a circular chamber deep within the palace, seated at a round table that had been carved from a single piece of crystal. Ethan took his place at the head of the table, with Cauldron on his right and the high priest on his left. The council members watched him with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. The meeting began with reports on the current state of the empire. Lord Mordhack, the Minister of Military Affairs, detailed fleet positions and strength assessments. Lady Saren, the Minister of Economic Policy, presented trade figures and resource allocation. Minister after minister delivered information in the measured tones of experienced administrators, and Ethan found himself struggling to keep track of the sheer volume of data. It was during a discussion of border tensions with the neighboring Corvin collective that Ethan spoke up for the first time. "Excuse me, Minister Vareth," he said, addressing the Minister of Foreign Relations. "You mentioned that the Corvins have been making incursions into the disputed systems along the Outer Rim. How long has this been going on?" Vareth, an elderly Valtarian with skin that had faded to pale green, regarded Ethan with barely concealed disdain. "For approximately 30 years, Your Majesty. The situation is stable. We have established protocols for managing these incursions." 30 years. Ethan repeated. That seems like a long time for a situation to remain unresolved. Have we attempted negotiations? We negotiated a border treaty 450 years ago, Vareth said. The Corvins signed it, and then began violating it within a century. Further negotiations would be pointless. They respect only strength. Ethan leaned forward. But if the incursions have been going on for 30 years with no change, then our current display of strength isn't working either, is it? Maybe the Corvins see the same thing from their perspective, that they signed a treaty and we're not respecting it. Maybe the treaty itself is the problem. The chamber went silent. Several council members exchanged glances, and Ethan worried that he had overstepped. But then Lord Thindril, who had taken a seat on the council as the representative of House Iron Peak, laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the crystal walls. "The human makes a valid point," Thindril said. "We have been managing this situation for 3 decades precisely because we refuse to consider that our 4-century-old treaty might no longer serve either side's interests. Perhaps it is time to negotiate a new understanding." Minister Vareth looked like he had bitten into something sour. "Your Majesty, if I may say so, you have been in this position for less than a week. The complexities of interstellar diplomacy are not something one grasps quickly." "You're absolutely right," Ethan agreed. "I don't grasp the complexities. But I do understand that doing the same thing for 30 years and expecting different results is the definition of insanity." He paused, then added more gently, "I'm not ordering you to renegotiate the treaty. I'm asking you to consider whether a fresh approach might be worthwhile. At worst, the Corvins refuse and nothing changes. At best, we resolve a long-standing issue and free up resources for other priorities." Vareth inclined his head stiffly. "I will consider it, Your Majesty." The meeting continued, and Ethan found himself speaking up several more times, always asking questions or suggesting alternative perspectives rather than issuing commands. He noticed Cauldron watching him with an expression of satisfaction, as if Ethan was performing exactly as hoped. After the council adjourned, Lady Morvanna approached Ethan as he was preparing to leave. She had been quiet during the meeting, observing without contributing. "Your Majesty," she said, her tone neutral. "Might I have a word in private?" Ethan glanced at Cauldron, who nodded and stepped away, leaving them alone in the chamber. Ethan braced himself for criticism or worse. But Morvanna surprised him. "You handle yourself better than I expected," she said bluntly. "When the throne chose you, I believed it had made a mistake, that the ancient mechanisms had finally failed after 10,000 years. I was prepared to oppose your rule, to work toward a restoration of traditional succession. But," Ethan prompted, "but I am a practical person, Your Majesty. I watched you in that meeting. You did not pretend to know things you do not. You asked questions and listened to answers. You offered perspective without arrogance. These are not qualities I expected from a human, and I confess that my prejudices have been challenged." Ethan felt a small surge of hope. "Does that mean I have your support?" Morvanna's expression remained guarded. "It means I will wait and observe before making my decision. You have not failed yet, but neither have you truly succeeded. The coronation will tell us much. The representatives of all major houses will be present, and many will test you. How you handle those tests will determine whether the empire unites behind you or fragments." "What kind of tests?" "Challenges to your authority, probably. Demands for concessions or special treatment. Perhaps attempts to manipulate you into decisions that benefit individual houses over the empire as a whole." She studied him carefully. "You are young by human standards, barely into your 4th decade. For a Valtarian, you would still be considered a child. That works against you. Many will see you as easy to control. Then I'll have to prove them wrong," Ethan said. Morvanna almost smiled. "See that you do, Your Majesty. The empire needs a strong leader, not a puppet. If you can be that leader, you will have my support. If you cannot, then I will do what is necessary to protect my house and my people." She left without waiting for a response, and Ethan was alone in the chamber. He sat down at the crystal table, feeling the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Every action was being scrutinized, every word analyzed for meaning. He was performing a balancing act where a single misstep could have devastating consequences. The days leading up to the coronation were filled with more meetings, more lessons from Cauldron, and more interactions with nobles who were all trying to assess the new emperor-regent. Ethan found himself exhausted each night, his mind spinning with names and protocols and political considerations. But he also found himself adapting, just as he always had. He developed strategies for managing the overwhelming flow of information, learned to read the subtle cues in Valtarian body language, and began to understand the unspoken rules that governed palace life. He also made time to meet with the human staff at the palace. It felt important to maintain that connection, to not lose sight of where he had come from. The other humans were shocked by his elevation, treating him with an awkward combination of familiarity and newfound deference. But they were also proud, and several expressed hope that his position might improve conditions for humans throughout the empire. That meeting more than anything else made Ethan understand the responsibility he carried. He was not just representing himself, or even just the Valtarian Empire. He was representing humanity, and his success or failure would affect how his entire species was perceived and treated. The night before the coronation, Ethan stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city. The view was breathtaking, towers of crystal and metal stretching toward the sky, lit by millions of lights, and the purple glow of the 3 moons. Somewhere down in those streets, ordinary Valtarians were living their lives, unaware or uncaring that tomorrow a human would be crowned as their leader. "Cannot sleep?" Cauldron's voice came from behind him. Ethan turned to find the prince approaching. "Too much on my mind. Tomorrow is going to be intense." Cauldron joined him at the railing. "I have spent my entire life preparing to rule, and I still feel unprepared. I cannot imagine how you must feel, having had only days." "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "What if I fail? What if the throne made a mistake?" "The throne does not make mistakes," Cauldron said firmly. "It chose you for a reason. Trust in that, even when you doubt yourself." He paused, then added, "I have been thinking about what the throne showed us. It said the empire must adapt or fall. I believe that means change is coming, whether we are ready or not. The galaxy is changing. New powers are rising. Old assumptions are being challenged. We Valtarians have ruled for 10,000 years, but nothing lasts forever unless it can evolve. Do you think the Empire can survive? Ethan asked. With the right leadership, yes. Cauldron turned to face him directly. You asked me once if I had ever faced an impossible challenge. I told you I had not truly. My life has been one of privilege and preparation. But now I face an impossible challenge. I must let go of everything I thought I knew about leadership and trust that a human janitor can succeed where I could not. He smiled. And somehow, I find that I do trust you. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the throne has given us, the ability to see past our prejudices and recognize worth in unexpected places. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, Cauldron, for everything. For nominating me, for teaching me, for believing in me. Thank each other when we have succeeded in saving the Empire, Cauldron said. Until then, we have work to do. The coronation ceremony began at dawn, as the first rays of the system's sun illuminated the palace's highest tower. The throne had been moved from the Chamber of Origins to the Grand Hall, a space so vast it could hold 10,000 beings. And it seemed that nearly that many had come to witness the unprecedented event. Ethan was dressed in robes that had been specially commissioned for the occasion, a combination of traditional Valtarian imperial regalia and elements that acknowledged his human heritage. The result was striking, the flowing fabric in deep blues and purples accented with silver threads that caught the light. On his right palm, visible to all, was the white scar from the trial, marking him as chosen by the throne. He processed into the grand hall to the sound of ancient music, instruments that predated human civilization playing melodies that had crowned emperors for millennia. The assembled crowd fell silent as he passed, thousands of eyes tracking his every movement. He could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their doubt. The throne sat on a raised dais at the far end of the hall, the black stone stark against the colorful tapestries and banners that decorated the space. Ethan climbed the steps slowly, each one feeling like it might be his last. At the top waited the high priest and the members of the High Council, along with representatives from every major house in the Empire. The ceremony itself was conducted in ancient Valtarian, the formal language of religion and state. Ethan had been coached on his responses, phonetically memorizing words he barely understood. He knelt before the throne as the high priest intoned prayers to ancestors and gods, asking for their blessing on this unorthodox succession. Then came the moment of coronation. The imperial crown, a circlet of crystalline metal embedded with gems from 100 worlds, was brought forward on a cushion of purple silk. The high priest raised it above Ethan's head and spoke the words that had crowned emperors since the empire's founding. By the authority of the ancestors, by the wisdom of the architects, by the judgment of the throne of ancients, I crown you Emperor Regent of the Valtarian Empire. May you rule with justice and guide your people toward prosperity. May the spark of innovation never dim in your heart. May the empire flourish under your leadership. The crown settled onto Ethan's head, and he felt its weight both physical and symbolic. He rose and turned to face the assembled crowd, and for a long moment, no one moved or spoke. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, and Ethan wondered if this was where the opposition would make itself known, if someone would challenge his right to the throne. Then Lord Thindrel's voice boomed out. Long live the Emperor Regent. The cry was taken up by others, slowly at first, and then building to a roar that shook the hall. Long live the Emperor Regent. Not everyone joined in. Ethan could see pockets of nobles who remained silent, their expressions closed off. But enough voices were raised that the message was clear. The throne's choice would be honored, at least for now. The ceremony continued with oaths of loyalty from the great houses, each representative approaching the throne to kneel and pledge their support. Some did so with obvious sincerity, others with barely concealed resentment. Ethan accepted each oath with the formal words he had been taught, aware that these were political necessities rather than guarantees of actual loyalty. It was late in the ceremony when Lady Morvana approached. She knelt gracefully, her elaborate gown pooling around her, and looked up at Ethan with an unreadable expression. "Your Majesty," she said in trade standard so he would fully understand. Morvanna of House Silvaris, pledge my loyalty to the throne and to you as its chosen regent. May your rule bring the changes the Empire needs." There was something in her tone that made Ethan focus. This was not just a formal oath. She was testing him, watching how he would respond. He thought quickly, then made a decision that he knew was risky but felt right. "Lady Morvanna," he replied in his accented but improving Valterian, "I accept your oath and value your service to the Empire. I would ask that you join the High Council as Minister of Innovation, a new position focused on identifying and encouraging necessary changes throughout our territories." The hall went silent again. Creating a new council position was not part of the coronation ceremony. It was an unprecedented move, and more than that, it was an acknowledgement that change was coming. It also put Morvanna in a position where she could influence policy directly rather than oppose from the outside. Morvanna's eyes widened slightly, the first unguarded reaction he had seen from her. Then she bowed her head. "I accept, Your Majesty. It will be my honor to serve in this capacity." As she rose and stepped aside, Ethan could feel the ripples of his decision spreading through the crowd. He had just demonstrated that he was not a puppet following a script, that he was willing to make bold moves, and that he intended to actively pursue the change the throne had called for. It was a gamble. Some would see it as strength. Others would see it as proof that he was dangerous. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a blur. There were more oaths, more formal declarations, more music and pageantry. When it finally ended, Ethan was mentally and emotionally drained, but he could not show it. As Emperor Regent, he was expected to attend the coronation feast, a multi-hour affair where he would be introduced to countless nobles and dignitaries. The feast was held in a hall that could have contained his entire former apartment building. Tables laden with delicacies from across the empire stretched in rows, and the air was filled with the scent of exotic spices and the sound of conversation. Ethan sat at the head table, with Cauldron to his right and the high priest to his left. Course after course was presented, each more elaborate than the last, and Ethan found himself tasting foods he could not identify while making small talk with nobles whose names he struggled to remember. It was during the 8th course that the challenge came. A Valterian noble Ethan had not been introduced to approached the head table. He was younger than most of the assembled nobles, perhaps only a century old, and his jade skin was marked with intricate tattoos that indicated warrior status. "Your Majesty," the noble said loudly, his voice carrying across the hall and causing conversation to cease. "I am Kaelric of House Stormwatch. My family has served the Empire with honor for 6,000 years, providing generals and admirals who have defended our borders against countless threats." Ethan nodded politely. "Your house's service is well known, Lord Kaelric. The Empire is fortunate to have such dedicated defenders." Kaelric smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are gracious, Your Majesty, but I must confess, I am troubled. House Stormwatch has always been loyal to the throne, but the throne has always been held by those of proven Valterian blood, by those who understand our ways and our history." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I mean no disrespect to your person, but I wonder if perhaps the situation calls for a regency council rather than a sole regent. The burden of ruling is heavy, and you are so recently arrived at this position. Surely experienced Valterian advisors should share the weight?" It was a direct challenge to Ethan's authority, phrased politely but clear in its intent. Kaelric wanted power, wanted to be part of a council that would effectively rule in Ethan's name, reducing him to a figurehead. The hall had gone completely silent, everyone watching to see how the human Emperor Regent would respond. Ethan took a sip of his wine, buying himself a moment to think. Then he set down his glass and met Kaelric's eyes directly. "Lord Kaelric," Ethan said, his voice calm and clear, "you raise a valid concern. The burden of ruling is indeed heavy, perhaps too heavy for any one being to carry alone. That is why the High Council exists, to share that burden and provide expertise in areas where the Emperor's knowledge may be lacking." He saw Kaelric's smile widen slightly, thinking he had won. But Ethan continued, "However, there is a difference between sharing burdens and abdicating responsibility. The throne did not choose a committee. It chose an individual. Not because that individual knows everything or can do everything, but because that individual possesses specific qualities that the throne deemed necessary for this moment in history. Ethan stood, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. You speak of your house's 6,000 years of service, and that is admirable. But I would ask you to consider this. 6,000 years ago, the Empire looked very different than it does today. The borders were smaller. The challenges were different. The galaxy itself was different. If your ancestors had tried to face those ancient challenges using methods from 6,000 years before their time, they would have failed. He moved out from behind the table, walking to the edge of the dais so he could address the entire hall. The throne chose me not despite my lack of experience with Valterian ways, but because of it. I bring a perspective unburdened by 10,000 years of tradition. I can ask questions that seem obvious, but have gone unasked because the answers were assumed to be known. I can suggest solutions that appear simple because I do not know all the reasons why they supposedly will not work. Ethan looked back at Kaelric. You are worried that I do not understand your ways. You are right. But perhaps that is exactly what the Empire needs right now. Someone who can see the situation with fresh eyes. Someone who is not locked into thinking about problems the way they have always been thought about. He paused, then added in a softer tone. But I also understand your concern, Lord Kaelric. You want to ensure the Empire is guided by wisdom and experience. So let me propose something. Join the High Council. Bring your house's 6,000 years of military knowledge to bear on the challenges we face. Work with me rather than against me. Help me understand the things I do not know, and in return, I will help you see possibilities you may have overlooked. Together, we can find the balance between tradition and innovation that the Empire needs. It was a masterful response, acknowledging Kaelric's concerns while simultaneously asserting his own authority and turning a challenge into an opportunity for collaboration. The hall erupted in murmurs of approval, and even Kaelric seemed taken aback. The young noble bowed deeply. Your Majesty, you speak with unexpected wisdom. I would be honored to serve on the High Council, and I apologize if my words seem challenging. I meant only to express my concerns for the Empire's welfare. Your concerns are understood and appreciated, Lord Kaelric, Ethan said. The Empire needs people willing to ask difficult questions and voice uncomfortable truths. Never hesitate to do so, but do it as a partner in governance rather than an opponent. As Ethan returned to his seat, he caught Cauldron's eye. The prince was smiling with obvious pride. Around them, the hall had returned to its previous buzz of conversation, but Ethan could sense a shift in the atmosphere. He had passed a test, proven that he could handle direct challenges with grace and intelligence. Not everyone would be convinced, but he had bought himself credibility. The feast continued long into the night, but Ethan's mind was already moving ahead, thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. The coronation was complete, his position officially recognized. Now came the real work of actually ruling an empire. The first month of Ethan's reign as Emperor-Regent established patterns that would define his leadership. He held daily council meetings, often marathon sessions that lasted for hours as ministers presented issues and Ethan asked questions that frequently led to revelations of systemic problems that had been ignored or accepted as unchangeable. His approach was consistent. Listen to the experts, acknowledge their knowledge and experience, but never accept that something had to be done a certain way simply because it had always been done that way. He pushed for explanations, for justifications based on current realities rather than historical precedent. And more often than not, his questions revealed opportunities for improvement that the more experienced Valterian administrators had overlooked. The situation with the Corvin Collective was a prime example. Minister Vareth, following Ethan's suggestion, had reluctantly opened negotiations for a new border treaty. The talks had initially seemed destined to fail, with both sides entrenched in positions based on the ancient agreement. But then Ethan had asked a simple question that changed everything. What if we stopped arguing about where the border should be and instead focused on what each side actually needs? It turned out that the Corvins were not expanding for expansion's sake. They needed access to specific resources in the disputed systems, resources that the Valterian Empire controlled but barely utilized. At the same time, the Valterians wanted assurance that their trade routes through Corvin space would remain secure. A new treaty was drafted that gave the Corvins mining rights in exchange for guaranteed safe passage, and a share of the extracted resources. Within 6 weeks, a 30-year border conflict had been resolved, and both sides were claiming victory. Similar breakthroughs occurred in other areas. The Ministry of Economic Policy restructured trade agreements with several minor species who had been complaining about unfair terms. The changes were relatively minor from the Empire's perspective, but made a huge difference to the affected worlds, generating goodwill that translated into increased cooperation and reduced administrative costs. Not every initiative succeeded. Ethan's attempt to reform the imperial bureaucracy ran into fierce resistance from entrenched interests who saw efficiency as a threat to their positions. His suggestion to establish an exchange program where Valtarian and human youths could spend time learning about each other's cultures was met with horror by traditionalists who saw it as a degradation of Valtarian purity. But even the failures taught important lessons, and Ethan learned to pick his battles. He found allies among the younger nobles and military officers who were more open to change, and he cultivated relationships with the influential priests who could sway public opinion. He also made a point of traveling to different systems within the Empire, showing himself to the people and listening to their concerns directly rather than filtering everything through layers of administration. It was during one of these trips, to an industrial system called Cormith 5, that Ethan encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned. Cormith 5 was a manufacturing hub, its cities dedicated to producing the ships and equipment that kept the Empire's military and merchant fleets operational. It was also home to a significant human population, workers who had been brought in decades ago because they could tolerate the harsh conditions better than Valtarians. Ethan's visit was supposed to be ceremonial, a quick tour of the facilities followed by a banquet with local administrators. But as his shuttle approached the main city, he saw something that the official briefings had not mentioned. In the shadow of the gleaming factories, there was a sprawl of makeshift housing, thousands of structures that looked more like refugee camps than proper residences. "What is that?" Ethan asked, pointing out the viewport. The local governor, a portly Valtarian named Dravok, followed his gaze and seemed uncomfortable. "That is the human quarter, Your Majesty. Temporary housing for the workers." "It looks more permanent than temporary," Ethan observed. "How long have those structures been there?" Dravok hesitated. "Some of them have been there for several decades, Your Majesty. The workers prefer them to the standard housing provided in the factory complexes." "Do they?" Ethan said quietly. "Or is that just what they tell you?" He insisted on touring the human quarter before the official factory tour. The governor tried to dissuade him, citing security concerns and schedule constraints, but Ethan was firm. If he was to be Emperor Regent, he needed to see all aspects of the Empire, not just the parts his administrators wanted him to see. The shuttle landed in a cleared area near the edge of the quarter, and Ethan stepped out into a scene that was both familiar and deeply troubling. The housing was indeed makeshift, constructed from scrap materials and whatever the residents could scavenge. There was no running water that he could see, no proper sewage system. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of industrial chemicals and human waste. People emerged from the structures as word of his arrival spread. Human faces, dirty and tired, wearing clothes that were patched and repatched. Children played in the dirt between buildings, their laughter at odds with their surroundings. An older man, his hair gray and his face lined with years of hard labor, approached cautiously. "Your Majesty," the man said in trade standard, bowing awkwardly. "We did not know you were coming. We would have prepared." "There is no need for preparation," Ethan said gently. "I came to see how my people are living." He gestured at the settlement. "Tell me honestly, how long have you been here?" 15 years, Your Majesty. I came to work in the factories. The pay was good, better than I could make on Earth. But the company housing," the man paused, choosing his words carefully. "It was not suitable for humans. Too cold, designed for Valtarian physiology. So we built our own homes." Ethan looked around, seeing the reality behind the official reports. These people were not choosing to live in squalor. They were making the best of a bad situation, adapting as humans always did. But they should not have had to. He spent the next 3 hours touring the quarter, talking to residents, seeing their makeshift schools and medical clinics, learning about their struggles and their hopes. Governor Dravok followed unhappily, making excuses and explanations that rang hollow against the evidence of neglect. When Ethan finally returned to the shuttle, his mind was made up. He summoned Dravok and the factory managers for an immediate meeting. In the shuttle's conference room, with Cauldron and his security detail present, Ethan laid out new directives. Within 6 months, proper housing will be constructed for all human workers on Cormith 5. Not Valtarian housing adapted for humans, but housing designed specifically for human needs. It will include running water, proper sanitation, heating, and cooling appropriate for human comfort. Dravok started to object. Your Majesty, the cost would be enormous. The factories operate on thin margins as it is. Then increase the margins, Ethan said flatly. The Empire pays for these manufactured goods. If the current prices do not allow for humane treatment of workers, then the prices are too low. He leaned forward. Or perhaps the problem is that too much of the revenue is going into the pockets of administrators and factory owners while the workers live in squalor. Your Majesty, this is highly irregular, one of the factory managers protested. The human workers signed contracts. They agreed to the terms of employment. Did they? Ethan challenged. Or did they agree because it was the only option available to them? When the choice is between poverty on Earth and slightly less poverty here, is that really a free choice? He stood, and everyone in the room rose with him. I am issuing an imperial decree. Within 30 days, every factory on Cormith 5 will be audited for worker conditions. Housing, safety, pay, everything will be examined. Where deficiencies are found, they will be corrected immediately at the expense of the factory owners. Any administrator or owner who resists or attempts to hide violations will face criminal charges. The silence in the room was absolute. Ethan had just threatened the established order, challenging powerful business interests who had operated with impunity for decades. It was a risky move, one that could create powerful enemies. But he could not unsee what he had witnessed. If he did nothing, what was the point of being Emperor Regent? Furthermore, he continued, I want a full empire-wide review of conditions for all human workers. This is not just a Cormith 5 problem. Anywhere humans are employed by imperial industries, they will be treated with dignity and provided with appropriate living conditions. The Empire will establish minimum standards for non-Valtarian workers, and these standards will be enforced. Your Majesty, Dravok said desperately, this will cause enormous disruption. Costs will soar. Some factories may shut down. Then they shut down, Ethan said. The Empire is wealthy beyond measure. We can afford to treat our workers humanely. If a business model requires exploitation to function, then it is not a business model worth preserving. News of Ethan's actions on Cormith 5 spread rapidly through the Empire. The human population celebrated, seeing in their Emperor Regent someone who truly represented their interests. Among Valtarian nobles and business leaders, reactions ranged from approval to outrage. Several factory owners banded together to lodge formal protests with the High Council, arguing that Ethan was overstepping his authority and interfering with free enterprise. The issue came to a head during a particularly contentious council meeting. Lord Mordhack, the Minister of Military Affairs, expressed concern that disruption in manufacturing could affect military readiness. Lady Saren worried about economic instability. Even Lord Thindril, who generally supported Ethan, questioned whether such sweeping changes should be made so quickly. But it was Lady Morvanna, in her new role as Minister of Innovation, who provided the key argument in Ethan's favor. Lords and ladies, she said, addressing the council, we speak of costs and disruption, but we fail to see the larger picture. For decades, we have treated human workers as expendable resources, paying them minimal wages and providing substandard conditions because we could, because they had no power and no voice. She looked around the table. But that approach has been short-sighted. Unhappy workers are less productive. Mistreated populations breed resentment that can explode into violence. And most importantly, we have wasted human potential. She stood, her voice gaining strength. Humans adapt. They innovate. They find solutions to problems we do not even recognize as problems. But we have given them no reason to do so on our behalf. We have treated them as servants when we should have treated them as partners. His Majesty is correcting a systemic failure that has weakened the Empire for generations. Her words shifted the debate. Within weeks, the reforms were implemented across the Empire. Human workers received better housing, fair wages, and representation in labor negotiations. The changes did cause disruptions, but they also unleashed unexpected benefits. Human workers, feeling valued for the first time, began contributing ideas for improving efficiency and safety. Productivity increased rather than decreased. Several humans were promoted to management positions, bringing fresh perspectives that revolutionized manufacturing processes. 5 years into Ethan's reign, the Valtarian Empire had transformed. The rigid hierarchies had softened. Innovation flourished as restrictions on new ideas were lifted. Relations with neighboring powers improved as the empire adopted more flexible diplomatic approaches. The economy grew stronger, diversified, and resilient. Most importantly, the population, both Valtarian and human, felt heard and represented. Cauldron, now recognized as the true power behind the throne and Ethan's closest advisor, often remarked that the throne had chosen better than anyone could have imagined. The prince had learned as much from Ethan as Ethan had learned from him, and together they had forged a new model of leadership that honored tradition while embracing change. On the 5th anniversary of his coronation, Ethan stood before a gathering of thousands in the capital. He spoke of the journey they had all taken together, of the challenges overcome and the lessons learned. He acknowledged that he remained, in many ways, just a human who once cleaned floors, but that perspective had proven to be exactly what the Empire needed. The Throne of Ancients had not made a mistake. It had recognized that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for change comes from the most unexpected source. The Valtarian Empire would endure for millennia more, stronger and more adaptable than ever before, all because a janitor's cut had awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.